Good evening and Happy New Year. Welcome to the first lecture of 2025 here at the Horological Society of New York. My name is Nicholas Manousis. I am the Executive Director here at HSNY, and I'm very happy to see such a big crowd out here on such a cold January evening. So let's get into it. An education update, we've got a full month of classes coming up here upstairs in our classroom on the 5th floor. If you haven't taken a class, I encourage you to look at our schedule and come and learn what makes a mechanical watch tick. Then we also have some traveling education dates coming up in Chicago and Washington, D.C. So looking forward to those as well. And coming up on Saturday, March 22nd is HSNY's 159th anniversary gala. And we have a good problem. Last year, we were at the Harvard Club directly across the street, and the gala just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and we've outgrown the Harvard Club. So for 2025, we are moving uptown to the Plaza Hotel, 5th Avenue and Central Park South. And it's a beautiful historic venue, and it's a really fun night where we all get dressed up. We raise a lot of money for scholarships for watchmaking students. So we've got a few tickets left. You can find all of the info regarding the gala on our website, hs-ny.org. So looking forward to seeing everyone there. And very happy to announce our 2025 exhibit, Early American Pocket Watches. It's on view now through December, so basically all year, upstairs in the Yost Berge Research Library on the 5th floor of the General Society building. It's really just an absolutely incredible exhibit. And I want to ask a question of everyone here. When you think about American watchmaking, what comes to mind first? Pocket watches, right? Okay, it's very relevant. What about some of the big brands? Maybe Hamilton, Bulova, Elgin, Waltham. You think about these big American brands that were manufacturing huge numbers of watches, mass manufacturing, the interchangeable part system. Maybe that's what comes to mind first. But there's a whole history to American horology that happened before those big brands. And that's the history that we are telling with this new exhibit, Early American Pocket Watches. And it is an underappreciated, fascinating, and just worthwhile history. So I encourage everyone to take a look at the exhibit upstairs when you have a chance. And you're going to learn a lot about the exhibit and the watches in it tonight. And I want to special announcement for people who are here tonight and not watching on YouTube. After the lecture, we can invite a small group upstairs to have a guided tour of the exhibit. So if you're interested in doing that, please stick around afterwards. Maybe we'll gather at the back. My colleague Sinjin can raise his hand there. He can help welcome everyone upstairs. We cannot fit everyone upstairs, so it's a smaller group, maybe 20 to 30 people. We'll figure it out when the lecture is over. All right. So now on to the main event. Early American pocket watches. So we're gonna have a lecture. Basically about what is on view upstairs, and who better to give a lecture about this new incredible exhibit than the owner of the collection, the person who brought all of it here from Chicago to New York. So I'm very pleased to welcome my great friend and antiquarian horologist, Richard Newman from DeKalb, Illinois. So please give Rich a hand.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nick, for the wonderful welcome. A watch was the most expensive consumer good that one can buy back in colonial times. It was a technical mystery that embodied the very height of technology and fashion, craftsmanship, artistry in the world. And it additionally conveyed one's stature in society, because only the very rich could afford a personal timekeeper, whether that was a clock or a watch. So very few people owned a personal timekeeper, whether you were in London or Paris, not to mention the relative primitive colonies here in America. It's an honor and a privilege to be here tonight and work with the Horological Society of New York to display a collection of early American pocket watches. It spans about 125 years of watchmaking. And whether you're a watchmaker, a collector, an educator, or you just like antiques or history like I do, I hope you find it interesting. My interest in early American pocket watches began about 25 years ago when I actually held, for the first time, a 250-year-old ticking pocket watch engraved with an American name on the movement and Boston. I was hooked. Very few makers in colonial America had the contacts and the capital relationships to import their own line of watches with their name engraved on them. And this was one of them. But by 1800, the economics had completely changed. So although still individually made, efficiencies and competition made watches affordable to the growing middle class for the first time. So that's the journey we're going to go on tonight. It was then, right around 1800, when the maker of this watch, Luther Goddard, began making pocket watches in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, which is located about 50 miles from Boston. He worked there with his two sons and a number of apprentices, and he made about 600 watches over a period of 20 years. He's really known as the first American watchmaker to mass produce. Now, this example was made within a few years of the War of 1812. It's often been said that the 1807 Jefferson embargo that restricted imports, combined with the War of 1812, that ushered in a huge wave of patriotism to buy locally made goods, really made this man's operations successful, Luther Goddard. But that's completely misleading, because by then he had already made and sold about 300 watches, so they were doing just fine. But patriotism is a real thing. This Baltimore watch, sold by Samuel Jones, who is one of the top watchmakers and retailers in America, has a stunning engraving of an American flag and shield. It also has one of the most advanced escapements of the time, what's called a Massey lever escapement, which was designed to reduce friction. Wealth on the East Coast was attracting the highest technology from Europe, as had been taking place for quite some time. But back to the Goddard watch and his low technology movements, located in Massachusetts. His cases are all made of silver, and they were also made locally. They're either unmarked or they have eagle stamps on them, and it's possible that his son Daniel made these cases. The case on this watch is unmarked, but here's a photo of a different case from the same maker that's upstairs in the exhibit with its distinctive eagle stamps. The multiple stamps on this case, on this silver case, are never seen on European watches. I think they're simply delightful. Watch buyers, even first-time watch buyers, were aware that hallmarks were important trade information because they indicated precious metal, silver, gold, or some alloy with silver and gold, and that may explain the abundance of marks we see on this case. If one hallmark was good, maybe several were better. About 60 miles from where Luther Goddard worked was another maker, and he came to America about 25 years earlier. His name was Thomas Harland, and he immigrated to America in 1773, just at the beginning of the conflict with English rule was taking place. And this is the year of the Boston Tea Party, and arrival of British troops right here in New York City a few years later, obviously to keep the peace. Harlan set up his operation in Norwich, Connecticut, a really old and quite prosperous port town, as I said, in Connecticut. Now, the name Harlan is pretty well known to clock collectors because he made some of the most beautiful tall case clocks you've ever seen with wonderful silver engraved dials. And he trained many clockmakers and watchmakers out of the shop in Norwich. He advertised that he also cut and supplied watch wheels and fusees and other components to the trade. A fusee is a common component in these early watches. It's cone-shaped, and it's designed to equalize the strength of the mainspring as the watch winds down. So when the watch is wound up with the key, obviously the spring is very tight, and the watch would run faster. As the watch winds down, the spring is not as powerful, the watch would run slower. But this cone-shaped gear sort of acted like a lever to equalize that power. Only a few of Harlan watches actually survive, but he was the largest maker in America at the time. And this watch dates somewhere around the mid-1790s. And it's one of my favorite pieces because it shows what was being sold to the emerging middle class, who never dreamt that they'd ever have enough money to afford their own watch. So just to demonstrate the different quality of watches being made during the late 18th century, here's a close-up of the balance cock of the Harlan watch on the left, next to a really high-quality watch imported from London with a ruby end stone. The Harlan watch, pretty low quality, targeting the middle class, while the one on the right, really high quality, that only the very wealthy could afford. And you could see here sort of this pretty crude filing out of this Harlan-made watch. Here we go. On the left, versus this really wonderful engraving and chased work here on the right with this big ruby end stone. So getting back to the Harlan watch, even the case, although it's a brilliant silver in appearance, is not silver at all. It's made of copper, zinc, nickel, and other alloys similar to nickel silver, but not quite. The point is that it looked great, just like silver, even though it has no silver in it. And it was also made in Connecticut. It also has an abundance of case stamps, and perhaps even the buyer wanted these sterling-like stamps punched in the case, just like we have knockoff labels today. So here we probably have the least expensive watch that was sold out of Thomas Harlan's shop with the least expensive case that one can actually put on a watch, of the quality and materials that ordinary middle-class Americans could afford for the first time in the 1790s. And can you just imagine how proud the buyer of this watch would have been 225 years ago? It was very likely the most expensive luxury gift that he ever bought for himself in his entire life. It was something like buying your first car. In between Goddard's location in Massachusetts and Harlan in Connecticut was this really fine maker. His name was John Carnes, and he worked in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, Providence had wealth, and clients there could afford a really good imported watch from London. London had the reputation of having the best clocks and watches in the world at this time. And they could also afford one made by this man, John Carnes, that he's likely sold for a little less money, or it came for with a longer guarantee. And Carnes advertised in the Providence Gazette in 1800 that he made Verge watches for $25, and he warranted them for 2 years. Like the makers we just looked at, Thomas Harlan, Luther Goddard, and others, John Carnes made watches with similar movement designs as makers back in England. And this was made by him in about 1795. So throughout the century, watchmakers in England were able to order watch kits, called eboshes, in an unfinished state, which required significant construction and hand finishing to complete, as clearly shown on this slide. Watchmakers could also buy watches from London and other watchmaking centers in southwest Lancashire, near the port of Liverpool, in a complete and ready-to-sell state with their names already engraved on the movement. European watchmakers and retailers conducted the business exactly in this way. And a few American retailers did the same thing if they could arrange the capital and connections to do so. So just to be clear, if you see a pocket watch, nearly every name that one sees engraved on these early pocket watches, anytime, from anywhere during the 18th century, was the name of the retailer, not the maker of the movement. We do know from surviving repair records that very few have American signed names, about 1 or 2% of the watches that were sold here. Most of these watchmakers made a living servicing and retailing. They also replaced broken hands, crystals, and dials, and replaced damaged or worn-out cases. In contrast, the makers that I've talked about so far, like Harlan, Goddard, and Carnes, were apparently able to get these watch kits and had the skills and equipment, supplies, and the determination to finish them in their own workshops. It was nearly impossible for Americans to get these kits while under English rule, and that's likely why the industry took some time to take off after the Revolution and to get on its feet. I'll talk a little bit more about makers working during the Revolutionary War in a bit. But first, back to this watch, John Carnes. But earlier I spoke about the fusee. You could see, here's the unfinished fusee on the left. Here's a finished fusee with its chain on it on the right, all of the gears cut out and the like. The back plate, all of this wonderful finishing and embellishments that really indicates the quality of the timepiece. So John Carnes was the subject of an extensive study that was published in the NAWCC Bulletin back in 2002 that actually speaks to how he made these movements, that he engraved the plates, pierced the balance table, spoked and mounted out the wheels, attached them to the arbors, which he made from pinion wire, assembled the plates and pillars, had them gilded. All of these watch movements are gold gilded. They're made of brass and then gilded. They planted the wheels, adjusted the escapement, had the watch cased. Other components such as the dial, the enamel dial, the fusee chain, mainspring, and the balance were imported. So why not make all the components? Simply because the knowledge and the capacity to make enamel dials and these other components, like the fusee chain and balance spring, were just impractical to make locally. Even in Europe, nearly every component of these watches were made by a specialist and provided to the trade. In America, these parts were readily available from wholesalers. And they also sold kits and parts to the clock industry. They made what they could finished the watch locally, and bought in everything else. It's typical watch manufacturing practice of the day. More than likely, most of these components came in that e-Bosch kit that I spoke about earlier. This Carnes-made watch, which is one of 3 known to survive, is early, judging by the minimalist engraving when compared with another later Carnes movement that's located on the right. The one on the left from about 1795, the one on the left from about 1795, the one on the right from about 1800. Both are signed by Carnes with similar layouts and rather naively engraved embellishments and a pretty simply made balance cock. And you could see that it's basically drilled out and then filed and engraved. But clearly you can tell that Carnes is creating a better finished watch, the one on the right, as he produced more output. Carnes also designed a unique fusee click system within these watches, giving evidence that makers were not only manufacturing on a very small scale, but also looking for ways to improve components for accuracy or resilience, or perhaps to reduce cost. Thankfully, the earlier Carnes watch also has a maker's mark on the inner silver case for a man named Saunders Pittman, who is an excellent American silversmith, literally worked just right next door to this watchmaker in Providence. Interestingly, he partnered briefly with a man named Cyril Dodge in 1793, a craftsman that also worked for Thomas Harlan up in Connecticut. So it's really quite clear to me that all these pioneer watchmakers knew each other. Thomas Harlan in Norwich, Carnes in Providence, Goddard in Shrewsbury, likely others, including a very, very interesting partnership that also worked in Massachusetts, just up the road from Luther Goddard in Sutton, and this is the firm Wheelock and Morse. Not everyone was satisfied with the typical verge and fusee watch design that was basically the standard watch coming out of Europe and sold here as well. So towards the end of the century in 1798, about the same time that Carnes was making watches in Providence and Harlan up in Norwich, and Goddard just getting started down the road in Shrewsbury, a brilliant young maker named Moses Morse was working with another man, Josiah Wheelock, in Sutton, Massachusetts, and they began making extraordinary watches of their own design. And this is one of them. Their surviving watches all have similar e-Bosches with an offset balance cock and a layout that is completely unique to this firm as far as I can tell. These do not have fusees, that cone-shaped gear. They're powered by what's called a going barrel. And this is like what was being made in France and Switzerland at the time. And it's a technology that just utilizes the middle portion of the mainspring to achieve a relative constant source of power for the escapement, thus negating the need and the cost of having the fusee. So obviously, by not using either end of the spring, you're able to have a more equal power going to the escapement. 3 surviving watches are known from this firm, and they're all similar, and they all have pretty rare escapements. Here's 2 of the watches, the one on the left with an escapement that's called a Vergoule, and the one on the right that's actually upstairs that we saw on the previous slide with a escapement that's called a Dubrafre escapement. Notice the slight change in design with that barrel bridge and the mainstream stop. That clearly indicates that they're improving the design over time. This inventor, Moses Morse, goes off on his own in 1803 and he relocates to Keene, New Hampshire, and that's where this watch was made. Now here's a close-up of the double wheel Dubrafre escapement. You don't need to be a watchmaker to notice the pretty crude work. 100% American. Still functions to this day. So these guys were one of the first to produce a uniquely American designed watch. However, the first was a man named Robert Leslie. Now, the name Robert Leslie is well documented as the principal partner in a firm called Leslie and Price, and quite a few of their London-made and imported watches survive, and 2 from their Philadelphia shop are showed on this page. And you can even see the difference in quality that they're importing. This one on the right with a very simple engraving here in balance cock, pretty crude, not very expensive, versus the one on the left that's much more intricate. Leslie was born in Maryland, and he made his way to Philadelphia in the late 1780s. In 1793, he relocated to London to supervise the manufacture and shipping of watches to his shop back in Philadelphia run by his partner, a man named Isaac Price. Their business model, with Leslie in London acting as their own buying agent, their own shipping agent, a person that could determine the quality and quantity and the features of watches and clocks being shipped from London to their shop in Philadelphia, was totally unique, never been done before. And so they were able to have direct control on a lot of aspects of their business that no other watchmaker had in America at the time. It's really a first for an American firm. Now, Leslie not only had a talent for running a transatlantic import business, he also received the very first clock patents and the very first watch patents in America, and they're signed by George Washington. He invented his own escapements for clocks and watches. He invented the torsion pendulum for clocks. This is the pendulum that you even see being sold today in department stores, where the pendulum moves very slowly around this way, like on anniversary clocks that are under a little round glass dome. That's a torsion pendulum. It goes back to Robert Leslie. He also was the first to patent a method to wind a pocket watch using the pendant instead of a key, later in 1793. I think he was the greatest American horologist of the time. Robert Leslie called one of his inventions the nautical watch, and 2 of these watches are known to survive. This movement is in a museum in England, in Bournemouth, and it actually has Leslie's own escapement that they called a chronometer escapement. Now, it's not a complex detent escapement as we equate today with the word chronometer, but it's really as the term was used in the last century. Unfortunately, like hundreds of other designs for watches, it was unsuccessful, both technically and commercially. But the famous author Rupert Gould, who basically wrote the book on chronometers in the early 1920s, called it a free balance escapement. So it's wonderful that one of these actually survives. The second one is in the exhibit. And this is fitted with a duplex escapement. Leslie offered his nautical watch with different escapements and different features. What's also special about Leslie's nautical watch patent is that it seems to be the first for a dual time zone dial, commonly called a captain's watch. They're still found on hundreds of thousands of wristwatches today. It's a watch with 2 dials, where you can set one dial to one place, like New York, the other dial to London, or wherever you wanted. It goes back to this patent, Robert Leslie. Leslie also had a really keen sense of manufacturing efficiency and marketing. And this movement was presumably manufactured as a salesman's sample. that he might have displayed in his shops in Philadelphia or in affiliate shops to generate orders, which he would then have manufactured in London. You'll note it's configured with 4 different styles for the hands. And you can also watch this, you can wind this watch either through the dial or from the back of the watch. Winding it through the dial was more popular on continental Europe. Winding in the back was more popular in England. So he's showing his customers the various ways in which you can order this, which, as I mentioned, he would then have manufactured in London and shipped back to Philly. So Leslie has basically designed one standard movement that would accommodate all of the features that he offered. The buyer could select different escapements as well as additional features, such as temperature compensation, a second style like this one has at the top, even a tide dial, and he used the same base movement that he designed to make it. And they were also pre-tapped. So if the client wanted pendant winding instead of winding with a key, the same base movement would be used to make it. It's really a first for watchmaking as well, and it's a critical step in the story of mass production. American ingenuity at its finest. This is back in 1793. Unfortunately, the story of Robert Leslie ends on a rather sad note. His contributions, that also includes making clocks and watches for Thomas Jefferson, as well as George Washington, were lost to history. And he's one of the many makers who died discouraged and bankrupt. Interestingly, his well-educated children did really well in life. A son became a famous portrait painter, but even more interesting was his oldest daughter, Eliza. I encourage you to look up Eliza Leslie. She became a very celebrated author, one of the first women authors in America. Okay, so now let's roll back the clock even further to colonial times when America was under English rule. This is a really quick shot of the 13 colonies and the major cities just to refresh your memory. Not surprising, there's proximity to the East Coast where shipping and commerce is taking place and safety from less populated areas. The largest cities are New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston. American signed watches from the colonial period are rare. People who needed to know the time, such as government officials, clergy, parishioners, doctors, they simply depended on public clocks, church bells, and the ever-accurate sundial, at least when the sun was shining. But really, sundials were everywhere. But as wealth grew, so did the demand for luxury items. Now, the Native American and African slave trade is part of this history, as we all know. Charleston was a major slave trade center, only second to New York. And you're almost certainly looking at an example of a slave owner's watch. This is apparently the only surviving solid gold colonial watch. It's signed by a man named Joshua Lockwood, a well-known Charleston clock and watchmaker, and it's an example of the finest and most expensive watch that one could buy anywhere in the world at the time. You had to be ultra rich to buy this. It was made in the early 1760s. The cases on this watch are solid gold, 22 karat, and it retailed for the enormous sum of 200 pounds, according to advertisements of the day. That's something like 5 to 7 years' salary for the average worker. The back of the outer gold case that's photographed on the right features a terrific chased and engraved repoussé case. It's a piece of art. And it depicts a Greek mythology tale about a boar hunt that would have appealed all too well to the plantation elite and their hunting traditions. No doubt Joshua Lockwood's clocks and watches were imported from London. However, he added features to appeal to his own clients, including slavery-themed clock dials. He also configured the watches that he sold with the dial, the hands, the case that his customers preferred. This is an advertisement from another famous clockmaker who was working a little bit before Joshua Lockwood in Boston and Philadelphia. His name is Benjamin Bagnall Jr. And this is just a quick snippet from about 1750. It states, imported in the latest ships from London, sold by Benjamin Bagnall out of his shop, a neat parcel of gold, pinchbeck, and silver watches. Watch chains, leather and silk string, West India rum, long whalebone, and 3 and 4 pennyweight nails by the cash. A year later, in 1751, his ad states that he has new silver watches, 8/8 clocks, with or without cases, twine suitable for sail makers, net twine, long lines, cod lines, gunpowder, even tin ovens. So very competent makers are engaged in many activities to maximize the opportunity to earn a living by leveraging their retail location, trading contacts, reputation, and access to capital. Never forget that watchmaking was a business. Makers had to be good businessmen or they just didn't survive. Now, the Bagnall name is one of the more well-known and successful clock-making families out of Boston. But clearly we see a pretty diverse business taking place nonetheless. The Bagnalls, the father, Benjamin Sr., and his 2 sons, Benjamin Jr. and the youngest son, Samuel, would have known every clock and watchmaker working in New England. There just weren't that many. And here's a watch that the youngest son, Samuel Bagnall, retailed back in 1741. It has a wonderful silver Champlevé dial that is signed Bagnall Boston. Champlevé comes from the French language and it means a raised field. They were cast or stamped, often in 2 parts, and then engraved. The numbers and signature are then filled with black wax so they pop, easy to see. And these silver Champlevé dials were common on watches until about the 1730s, when the all-white enamel dials came into fashion. And swapping out dials to keep up with the latest fashion and the style was really common. People would bring in their pocket watches to the local watchmaker, and they'd be happy to swap out these silver dials for a white enamel dial. But thankfully, it wasn't done on this really early watch. There's only 3 known American signed watches from the first half of the 18th century, and this is one of them. The movement is gilded brass, just like we'd expect, really nicely finished, typical of English quality work. It was likely ordered and imported by Samuel Bagnall for one of his wealthy clients. Wonderfully, within this watch were a number of watch papers, including this one. This is the oldest American watch paper that exists. The numbers around the circumference is an equation of timetable that's used to compare or set your watch to a sundial. It says sold by Samuel Bagnall, watchmaker in Cornhill, Boston, New England. And there is a sundial under the name, which perhaps is a rendering of his shop sign. So it may show us what his sign actually looked like outside of where he worked. At the center of the paper features a dog that you see on the left. Next to the dog is a laborer pulling a sled of hides. then 2 colonists wearing tricorn hats, and finally a tall case clock on the far right. In between the 2 colonists is another sundial that's sitting on a pedestal. So watch papers were early advertising, and the maker would place it between the inner and outer cases of the watch, and watches of this period ran for 24 hours for one day. It actually ran for 26 hours, cover you a little bit, but right around there. So every day, the owner of the watch, if he was running the watch, would be opening the case, would see the watch paper within it, and it would remind the owner of where to go to get his watch serviced or maintained. Early papers are beautifully made, works of art. They were probably created that way to incent the watch owner to keep it right where it belongs, within the pear case. Okay, so what the heck is a pear case? Here's a typical pear-cased watch. The watch literally has 2 cases, sometimes 3, but most often 2. To get at the watch to wind it, the outer silver case is opened to reveal the inner case with the watch. You remove the watch from within the outer case and flip it over, which would expose the winding hole, which you'd use to wind it up every day. And as you see, between the 2 cases is sitting a watch paper. Okay. So this is the last watch I'm going to talk about in this presentation. It's signed Wright, New York, on the dial. It's also signed on the movement, and this is the earliest American watch that exists. John Wright was one of the very first makers to come to America, sailing from the port of Liverpool to New York City in about 1711. And this watch dates to right around 1715 or so. So it's well over 300 years old. Can you picture what New York City looked like back then? Only about 5,000 people with swampland, farming plots, stables, shops, houses. Colonists anxiously looking over the waves for the sails in the distance, bringing newcomers supplies and mail, all sorts of things that they may never have seen before. But not in the late fall or the winter, because the sea was just too dangerous to travel the 6, 7, even 10 weeks to get from England to the coast. Just brutal. Well, John Wright's clock and watch shop was on Duke Street. Duke Street still exists today, lower Manhattan, but it's called Stone Street. All street names that honored the monarch, like King Street, Queen Street, Duke Street, etc., were renamed when the Revolutionary War was over. Stone Street actually existed before. So it goes back very old, very, very, very long time, and it was called Stone Street, you guessed it, because it was the first paved street in the colony. Anyway, this is a great watch, and it features a seldom seen automation dial with a second subsidiary dial. Precision timekeeping for a 300-year-old watch. It was the highest tech and fashion of the day. Just pure magic in every sense of the word. And by the way, these watches were great timekeepers when they were new and if well maintained. They definitely kept time within half a minute or less a day. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the sun and moon automation dial. It has a 24-hour rotating disc beneath the silver dial that displays a sun with clouds during the day and a moon with stars during the nighttime hours. The sun and moon, as you could see, are opposite each other, so when the sun rises, the moon is no longer visible through the aperture, and vice versa. So here, the moon is pointing between the Roman numerals 8 and 9 for the hours. And the single hand, which is just the minute hand, is pointing to 34. So the time is 8:34, obviously at night, because we're seeing the nighttime side of the disk. Believe it or not, this watch surfaced for the first time only 20 years ago when it came up in a small auction in New England, New Hampshire. How it escaped notice for 300 years. Just a complete mystery. But its discovery was really important because it evidenced that watchmakers and the transatlantic trade that made working in the colonies possible for these fine, skilled craftsmen was taking place much earlier than previously thought. And it began right here, apparently, in New York City for watchmaking. The catch at the bottom releases the movement from the case and reveals a nicely finished gilded brass mechanism, as one would expect. The pierced and engraved balance cock or balance table on the back of the watch, its purpose is to protect the hairspring underneath. And on this watch, the balance clock is made of silver. Again, really high cost. So back to this wonderful silver Champlevé dial. Most interesting is that it's convex. As you could see here, the center is about 2 millimeters higher than the rest of the dial. It's really unusual. And we think it was made that way in New York to fit the automation wheel underneath. The movement was also likely finished by John Wright in New York, although it's really hard to prove. It would have been shipped to him in an unfinished state by his relatives who worked in the trade back where he was born near the port of Liverpool, actually in a small town called Crompton. Now, some collectors will notice, for example, that the pillars are mounted upside down. It's wonderful. So in just a short period of time, we've looked at just a few interesting watches that are part of America's rich watchmaking history. I just want to thank you for listening, and I hope you have time to enjoy the exhibit where you could see these watches and many more up close. And thank you again so much for coming out on this very cold evening.
All right, now it's time for Q&A. If anyone has a question for Rich, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. We'll start back here with Hyla.
Hi, that dual time zone watch that you showed us, is that the first ever dual time zone watch?
It's the first one, it's the earliest one I've ever found or have ever seen. It's the earliest that's ever been patented. So I think it is. Now, interestingly, as I said that earlier, he called it his nautical watch. He didn't make this for the Royal Navy or expeditions or anything like that, where really precision chronometers were being made, and they were horrifically expensive. Even after the chronometers came about by John Harrison, many of you know the story of Longitude by John Harrison, most people who had shipping businesses couldn't hope to afford a chronometer. They were still using dead reckoning 100 years later. Leslie invented something that was a little better than a regular pocket watch, his nautical watch. His market were merchants that were coming back and forth between Europe and America, maybe England and continental Europe, something like that.
Other questions? All right, then back here to Frankie.
Thank you. Excuse me. and looking at these well-designed watches from early America, as watchmakers today, how do we try to extend that type of design and craftsmanship in today's market, or is there a need for it, or you have to kind of flow with the times?
Okay, so the question was, how can we apply some of this to what's being done today? And there's a lot of wonderful watchmaking happening, as we know right now in wristwatches. There are thousands of wristwatch designers and manufacturers, many of them making very small numbers of watches that are horrifically expensive and wonderfully made, wonderfully engineered. As I said earlier, this, watchmaking was about fashion, technology, artistry, just like watches today in the dials. And actually, I think there's a lot of really great, interesting dials that were made on pocket watches, even going back to the 16th century. And a lot of that inspiration can be used for designing watch dials today. Other questions?
There was a picture of, I don't remember the maker. It had the watch, and then there were, it looked like 3 keys. And were those all part of operating the watch?
Okay, great question. As we saw when I displayed the case, the pair case, and the single hole that one would insert the key to wind the movement. And then I'm showing you the movements that you could actually open up and look at. Dust, grime, all of the soot from the lamps of the day, salt water and the like. They'd really do a number on these, and they had to be serviced and oiled every 1.5 or 2 years to be in running condition. And back then the oils, the finest oils, were porpoise oil or whale oil or something of that nature that gets rancid rather quickly. Many keys had 2 arbors on them, others have 1, because you set the hands on these watches through the front of the dial, actually on the arbor that holds the hands. You set the key right on the top of the dial onto that arbor, and as you turn that clockwise, the hands can be set to the current time. So sometimes you had keys. The other thing that's interesting, going back to fashion, many of these watches had wonderful watch chains, very elaborate. And if you go back in time and look at portraits, the royalty are wearing 2 watches. They have all sorts of stuff hanging from these chains, multiple keys and other wonderful trinkets and the like. So again, sort of part of the fashion of the day, if you will.
Thanks. Is there any documentation on how long it took them to make watches then, for context, versus today? How long is 300 watches a lot in a career? Is it not a lot?
Yeah, good. That's also a really good question. I'm going to answer that in a couple ways. In the craft that was taking place in Europe, and obviously the watches that we looked here today, most of them imported, the early ones made here, very, very small numbers. It took something like 100 to 130 craftsmen were involved in making that pocket watch. It was piecemeal labor, and then you had, the aggregators and the like, and the middlemen. So girls and women would be just making that little fusee chain by the piece and the like. But I think for a lot of these watches, they were bespoke, meaning that the client would order the watch, especially the earlier you go into the early 1700s and prior to that. They would order the watch, the watchmaker would have it made and then delivered. And it probably took a couple months to do that. Now here in America, because of the shipping back and forth, and they didn't ship during the winter, you can imagine what it was like with the logistics. You write a letter to your supplier somewhere in London, whatever, here's what I'm looking for. That letter may not get to him for 4 months. Then he's got to get the stuff and send it back to you. Might be 4 months later. The watchmaker may be dead by then. It was a risky business, and it's the literature and these letters and the like are filled with all this interesting history of trusting, you know, the delivery and the pickup and the paying for, right? There's no standard money going on. It's not like you can issue a check. So I find all of that really fascinating. Dealing with that export trade, that import-export trade, you know, was really complicated. And interestingly also, a lot of these early makers were involved in the Quaker community. The Quaker community, based on trust. And you can find letters where you have early watchmakers. There's one upstairs by a man named Caleb Wheaton, who writes to a relative back in England saying, can you introduce me to another Quaker, a watchmaker, who I can liaise with to begin to import parts and watches to America. And he's doing that because there's a level of trust within that church that, you know, you're not going to get worked over. It's going to happen. Really difficult business.
Quick follow-up. Is that how the Quakers ended up in Pennsylvania, or how watchmaking ended up in Pennsylvania?
I don't know if it's either, honestly. But you also had Quakers that were working in England. And one of the best English watchmakers who lived was a man named Daniel Quar, and he was the clockmaker to the king in the late 1690s, right around 1700, just when after the Quakers were able to practice without being persecuted, which was happening probably a couple decades before that.
Thank you for a lovely lecture. Quick follow-up. Are there actually any documentation of payment terms and other stuff of that? Was it barter? Is there actually documentation of how they would structure deals?
Not that I have found, but it's not my area of research. It might be out there. Even knowing what these watches cost or what services cost are pretty difficult. You know, one thing, inflation wasn't an issue. Prices stayed relatively the same for a very long time. To service a watch, have it oiled and serviced, was about $1.75 to $1 throughout much of the 18th century and into the early 19th century. And we know that because oftentimes when you look at these watch papers, something that I really enjoy looking at, and you flip them over, there's often a receipt on the back of the watch paper. It identified the owner of the watch, what was done, and the cost, sort of the receipt that he slapped back in the watch when he gave it back to you. So we have a lot of information around what servicing cost, and there's a number of record books that are out there of early watchmakers. But I really don't know what's entailed with the ordering of e-Bosches and the cost of that. There's actually very few e-Bosches that exist. There's collectors of e-Bosches, but I don't even know if there's any complete e-Bosch kits where we know 1730, this is what it looked like. 1760, this is what it looked like. 1790, here's what it looked like. You know, we know what the movements look like. We can identify the movements. But just in terms of what could be ordered, what came in the kit, don't know.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Right here.
When it comes to, and thank you for the lecture, but when it comes to the pocket watches made during this time frame, what's known about the tools that were used to make them and service them? Were they all kind of bespoke, made by hand by the watchmaker, or were there actual kits available that they would purchase from either overseas or get passed down?
It's really the latter. There was tooling that was available to cut wheels and all sorts of tools for the trade, which are really significant sets and very expensive. There's a famous supplier called Wyke and Green, who was out of London. Peter Stubbs is another one out of London. Their catalogs actually exist. They go back to about, I think, the 1760s or so, 1770s. But they're very complete. Everything from tweezers, 20, 30 pages of all sorts of things that you can buy for watchmakers to actually mount, cut gears, all that sort of stuff. So it was done by machine. They were just hand machines.
All right. Well, this was an absolutely incredible lecture. I think we should all give Rich another hand here. Thanks, Mike. Very nice. Appreciate it.